The gallery sat in the heart of the city's cultural district, a place where the wealthy, the famous, and the influential came to see what they believed to be the best the art world had to offer. Tall, sleek windows illuminated the space with natural light, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. In the center of the gallery hung pieces by world-renowned artists, the kind of works that commanded prices in the millions. The walls were lined with contemporary sculptures and paintings, each one with a story and a price tag that only the elite could afford. It was in this atmosphere that Charles Ralston, the owner of Ralston Gallery, held court. A man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and an impeccably tailored suit, Charles had an air of superiority that made even the most confident artists second-guess their worth. He had built his reputation as a tastemaker, someone who could spot genius when others failed to see it. He was the authority in the art world, and nothing irritated him more than those who tried to challenge that authority. That morning, Charles was sitting behind his desk in his office, flipping through the latest auction catalogs. His mind was consumed with the prospect of the upcoming high-profile art auction, where several pieces from deceased European masters were expected to fetch extraordinary prices. He hardly noticed the door open until a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, Mr. Ralston. A young man is here to see you. He says he's an artist." Charles looked up, narrowing his eyes. He wasn't in the mood to entertain yet another hopeful artist who thought they had what it took to make it in the high-end gallery world. He waved a dismissive hand toward his assistant, signaling that he didn't have time for such trivial matters. "Tell him to submit his portfolio through the proper channels." "I'm busy," Charles muttered. But the assistant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Ralston, he insists it's urgent. He says his work is worth millions." At the mention of millions, Charles's ears perked up, though not in the way one might expect. He wasn't excited at the prospect of a new artist who could bring in that kind of revenue. No, it was the sheer audacity of someone claiming such value that piqued his curiosity. "Let him in," Charles said, his voice sharp, as he closed the catalog in front of him. A moment later, the young man entered the office. He was in his mid-20s, with an air of confidence that Charles found unsettling. He was tall and lean, dressed in a simple black hoodie, ripped jeans, and worn sneakers. His skin was a deep, rich brown, his hair cropped short in a way that suggested he cared little for fashion trends. His eyes, however, were piercing, dark and unwavering as he stood before Charles. "Mr. Ralston, I'm Ian Blackwood," the artist said, extending a hand. Charles hesitated for only a moment before shaking it. There was something about this young man that made him uncomfortable. He had the kind of quiet confidence that didn't come from mere talent, it came from something deeper. But Charles wasn't one to be intimidated. He had built his empire on knowing exactly who was worth his time and who wasn't. "Mr. Blackwood, I assume you're here to show me your portfolio?" Charles said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Ian nodded, pulling a sleek black portfolio from under his arm. He placed it on the desk with a soft thud, not saying anything at first. Charles noticed the thickness of the portfolio. It looked like more than just a collection of paintings. There was something different about the way Ian presented himself. The artist didn't seem eager to prove himself, which only irritated Charles more. "Let's see what you've got," Charles said dismissively, opening the portfolio without hesitation. The first piece he saw was a large, abstract canvas, vibrant swirls of colors clashing against one another in a chaotic yet strangely harmonious way. It was bold, dynamic, and unapologetic, but Charles didn't care for it. To him, it was just another piece of art trying too hard to make a statement. He flicked the page over to the next one, already bored. But with each new piece, his disinterest grew. More abstract works, more colors that didn't fit together, more pretentious nonsense that seemed to scream, "Look at me," without saying anything of substance. There was no subtlety, no hidden genius to be found. At least, that's what Charles told himself as he flipped through the pages. "So, Mr. Blackwood," Charles said, looking up with a smug grin. "Tell me, what makes you think these pieces are worth millions?" Ian met his gaze without hesitation, his eyes unwavering. The work speaks for itself, Mr. Ralston, he said simply. Charles chuckled, shaking his head. Let me be blunt. These are, well, they're not bad, but they certainly aren't anything that would make me consider putting them on display in my gallery. And as for millions? That's a little far-fetched, don't you think? Ian didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, a quiet confidence in his demeanor. You don't see it yet, but these pieces have a story behind them. Each one is tied to something much bigger, something that's been hidden in plain sight. You'll find out soon enough. Charles waved his hand dismissively. Spare me the pretentious backstory. If you want to be taken seriously in this business, you need to show me something with real value, something that can sell. Art is about more than just an idea, it's about who's willing to buy it. Ian remained silent, his gaze fixed on Charles. There was a moment of tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. But just as quickly as it appeared, Ian broke the silence. I don't need you to sell my art, Mr. Ralston. I'm not here for your approval. I'm here to show you that what you think you know about the art world is about to change. Charles narrowed his eyes. This was either the most arrogant young artist he'd ever met or the most deluded. Either way, he didn't have time for games. Well, then, Mr. Blackwood, you've wasted enough of my time. If you're not here to sell, then perhaps you should be on your way. Ian smiled, a slight, knowing smile that Charles couldn't quite read. You'll regret turning me away, Mr. Ralston, Ian said, his voice calm but tinged with an undeniable authority. But I suppose you'll figure that out when the time comes. With that, Ian turned and walked out of the office, leaving Charles staring after him, confused, irritated, and strangely intrigued. As the door clicked shut behind Ian, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something about this encounter had left him unsettled. He wasn't one to take artists seriously who thought they could dictate terms. But there was something in the young man's gaze, something that hinted at a far deeper knowledge, that made Charles feel like he had missed something crucial. The thought gnawed at him as he returned to his desk, dismissing it with a shake of his head. He would never buy into the hype of an unknown artist. After all, there were always more submissions, more artists begging for a chance to be seen. But something lingered, a question that Charles would soon find himself unable to ignore. The next few days passed in a blur for Charles Ralston. He tried to push the encounter with Ian Blackwood out of his mind, telling himself that the young artist was just another naive dreamer. The gallery was busy preparing for the upcoming auction, and Charles had enough on his plate to focus on anything other than the fleeting impression of the artist with the millions-worth portfolio. But every now and then, he couldn't help but think back to the way Ian had looked at him, that quiet confidence, the unshakable belief that his art held value beyond anything Charles had seen. It was irritating. It unsettled him. It made him wonder, if only for a second, if maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated the young man. A week after their first meeting, Charles received an unexpected package at the gallery. It was addressed to him in crisp, clean handwriting. There was no return address, and inside there was a note. Mr. Ralston, I told you there was more to my work than meets the eye. I'm giving you one more chance to see its true value. If you still don't believe me, then maybe you should consider who's buying and selling art in the future. With the note was a single photograph, a stunningly vibrant image of one of the pieces Ian had shown him, an abstract painting of swirling reds and oranges with small streaks of silver scattered throughout. The piece was hung on the wall of a grand, minimalist space, an art gallery with high ceilings and sophisticated lighting that illuminated the piece as if it were the centerpiece of an entire collection. The photograph was professionally taken, but it wasn't just the quality of the photo that caught Charles's attention, it was the setting itself. It didn't take long for Charles to realize that the gallery in the photograph was not one of the common spaces he was familiar with. The layout was sleek, almost futuristic, with cutting-edge technology embedded into the design. The type of gallery that only catered to the wealthiest and most influential collectors in the world. Charles's breath caught in his throat as he examined the photo more closely. That was the Beldrick Gallery. It was an exclusive art venue in Paris, known only to a select few, most of them the world's top art buyers, the type of clients who regularly dropped millions of dollars without a second thought. Charles had heard rumors of Beldrick Gallery, but he had never seen it in person. Its owners kept a tight grip on their exhibitors and purchases. Very few artists were ever allowed to show in its space. To be displayed, there was the kind of honor that could launch an artist into the highest echelons of the art world. Charles felt a cold twinge of realization run through him. Ian's work wasn't just displayed in an exclusive gallery. It was being taken seriously by the kinds of people Charles had always envied, the movers and shakers of the art world. These were the people who had the power to set the market price, to influence trends, and to buy the works that everyone else would later be clamoring to own. Charles could feel the sweat starting to bead on his forehead. How had he missed this? How had he brushed off someone who was connected to such high-profile buyers? He quickly grabbed his phone, dialing the number of his assistant, who answered on the first ring. "Mr. Ralston?" his assistant said, sounding surprised. "What can I do for you?" "Get me everything you can find on Ian Blackwood," Charles barked, his voice sharp with sudden urgency. "I want to know who he is, who he knows, and where his work has been shown. Get me everything, and don't waste any time. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Ralston. I'll get right on it." Charles hung up and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The more he thought about Ian, the more certain he became that he had made a grave mistake. Ian wasn't some naive, unknown artist. He was someone with connections and influence, someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and he had played Charles for a fool. As the days passed, Charles grew more and more obsessed with finding out who Ian really was. He asked around among his contacts in the industry, but the responses were frustratingly vague. No one seemed to know much about him, but the few who did speak of him said one thing with certainty: Ian Blackwood was not someone to be underestimated. Charles could feel the pressure mounting. He had always prided himself on being ahead of the curve, on having an eye for talent, before it was recognized by the mainstream. But here he was, fumbling, late to the game, and possibly on the verge of losing his place at the top of the art world to an up-and-coming artist who seemed to be playing by a completely different set of rules. Then, one morning, as if on cue, a courier arrived with another package from Ian Blackwood. This time, there was no note. Instead, inside the package was a sleek, leather-bound book. Charles opened it to find high-quality images of Ian's artwork, far more polished and professional than the earlier ones. Each page showcased a different piece, accompanied by a short description of the work's inspiration. As he turned the pages, Charles found himself growing more and more intrigued. The pieces were unlike anything he'd seen before. They were abstract, yes, but there was a deeper level of complexity to them, an underlying tension in the brushstrokes, a hidden narrative that seemed to unfold the more one studied the work. But what struck Charles the most was the pricing. Each piece was labeled with a price that was far beyond anything he would have ever considered for an unknown artist. The final page of the book displayed a piece titled The Rebirth of the Soul. It was an intricate canvas of blacks, purples, and silvers, with swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with energy. The description accompanying the piece was simple yet powerful. This work represents the personal journey of transformation and awakening. It speaks to the challenges we face when we choose to break free from the expectations of others and step into our true potential. The price listed for this painting, $5 million. Charles blinked, his breath catching in his throat. $5 million. He glanced at the other prices in the book, all of them higher than what most established artists could command. The works were bold, modern, and innovative, yet they didn't have the same pretentious, overdone quality that he had seen in so many other high-priced pieces. There was something raw, something genuine about Ian's work. Charles could feel the excitement rising in his chest. He had missed something, something important, and now it was too late to turn back. Ian Blackwood wasn't just an artist, he was a force in the art world, and Charles had just learned the hard way that underestimating him could have serious consequences. Charles quickly dialed his assistant again, this time with a new sense of urgency. "I need to get in touch with Ian Blackwood. I want to offer him a deal, something big." do whatever it takes to get him back in this gallery. He's worth far more than I realized. He paused for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about a young artist anymore. This was about staying relevant in a world that was rapidly changing, a world where the game was shifting, and those who couldn't adapt would be left behind. Charles sat back in his chair, the realization heavy in his chest. He had mocked Ian Blackwood, assuming his work was nothing more than a passing phase. But now, the tables had turned, and Charles was the one who would have to prove himself worthy of being in Ian's presence. The days following Charles Ralston's realization were a whirlwind of action. He could feel the tension building with each passing moment as he awaited word from his assistant. Ian Blackwood, the artist he had so callously dismissed, was now a mysterious and powerful figure in the art world. Charles's thoughts were consumed with the idea of gaining access to Ian's work before any other gallery owner had the chance to do so. At first, the response from Ian's camp had been less than enthusiastic. His assistant had tried reaching out multiple times, but the messages went unanswered. It became clear that Ian wasn't interested in playing by the same old rules that Charles had relied on for years. He wasn't going to be swayed by the usual tactics, the old art world power dynamics that Charles knew so well. Frustration simmered beneath the surface of Charles's usually composed demeanor. He had spent years building his gallery's reputation, curating collections that garnered attention from the elite buyers. To be bested by a newcomer like Ian, an artist he had once ridiculed, was an insult. But more than that, it was a wake-up call. The world of art was changing, and Charles wasn't sure if he was ready for the transformation. Just as Charles was about to give in to the frustration, his assistant entered the office with an envelope. He handed it over without a word, and Charles tore it open, reading the letter inside. The handwriting was neat and precise, unmistakably Ian's. Mr. Ralston, I see you're finally starting to understand the true value of my work. I think we can both agree that my art is worth much more than what your gallery could have offered. But I'm willing to give you one more opportunity to prove your worth to me. I'm in Paris this week for a private viewing of my latest collection at the Galactic Gallery. If you're serious about working with me, I suggest you show up. If not, you can forget about ever seeing my work again. Charles's eyes widened as he read the letter. Ian wasn't just playing hard to get, he was calling the shots. He was now in control, and Charles knew it. The power had shifted. The young artist who had once been mocked was now a sought-after commodity, and Charles wasn't sure how to reclaim the ground he had lost. Without wasting a moment, Charles immediately booked a flight to Paris. He knew this was his chance to repair the damage he had caused and reclaim his standing in the art world. There was no room for hesitation now, he had to act quickly. The flight to Paris felt like an eternity. Charles spent the entire journey replaying every detail of his interactions with Ian in his mind. How had he been so blind? What had he missed? Why hadn't he recognized the true value of Ian's work from the beginning? When Charles finally arrived at the Galactic Gallery, he was struck by the sheer opulence of the space. It was everything he had imagined, a breathtaking, minimalist gallery that showcased art in the most prestigious setting imaginable. High white walls gleamed under soft, strategic lighting, and the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. The guests gathered around the display, dressed in their finest attire, all murmuring in excitement as they admired the artwork on display. Charles felt a sense of unease creep over him. The gallery was filled with collectors and influencers, many of whom he recognized from the top circles of the art world. There was a palpable air of exclusivity here, one that Charles had never quite experienced before. It was the kind of crowd that didn't need to ask questions about price, it was understood that if you had to ask, you didn't belong. He scanned the room for Ian, but he couldn't find him among the guests. His pulse quickened as he realized that Ian wasn't just an artist, he was someone who knew how to move in this world, someone who had learned the power dynamics and understood how to leverage his position. He had made himself scarce, and now Charles was left in a room full of potential buyers, all of whom had access to what was once his. It was then that Charles saw Ian. He was standing near the center of the room, dressed in a simple black suit that somehow made him stand out more than any of the extravagant outfits around him. His presence seemed to command the space, and there was an air of authority in the way he interacted with the other guests. He wasn't just an artist at this event, he was a buyer, a dealer, a key player in this exclusive world. Charles made his way through the crowd, trying to maintain his composure. His mind was racing. He had come here to strike a deal, to get access to Ian's work, before any other gallery owners had the chance. But as he approached Ian, he couldn't help but feel like the tables had turned. He was the one now in need of approval, and Ian was in control. When Ian saw him, a slight smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It wasn't the kind of smile Charles had expected. It wasn't smug or triumphant. Instead, it was almost knowing, as if Ian had been waiting for this moment all along. "Mr. Ralston," Ian said smoothly, his voice calm and measured. "I see you made it after all. I trust your flight was comfortable?" Charles's throat tightened, but he forced a smile. "It was, thank you. I came as soon as I received your invitation. I must say, I didn't realize how prestigious this gallery was. You've certainly raised the stakes." Ian's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. "It's not about raising the stakes, Mr. Ralston. It's about changing the game. You see, art isn't just about selling, it's about understanding the value behind the work. The true value. Something you seem to have missed earlier." Charles swallowed hard. He had expected some level of arrogance, but hearing Ian speak with such authority was unsettling. The young man wasn't just an artist now, he was a player in this world, and Charles wasn't sure where he fit into the equation anymore. "I've had some time to think about our previous conversation," Charles said, his voice steady despite the nervousness creeping inside. "I'm ready to discuss terms. I'd like to work with you, perhaps showcase your collection in my gallery." Ian raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid that ship has sailed, Mr. Ralston. I'm not looking for just any gallery to display my work. I'm looking for a partner, someone who understands the art world as it's evolving. And I have to say, I'm not sure you're that person." Charles felt his stomach drop. The words stung more than he expected. He had spent years at the top, and yet here was this young artist, telling him that he wasn't qualified to be part of this new era. Ian's gaze never wavered, and Charles realized with a sinking feeling that he was being outmaneuvered at every turn. "I think," Ian continued, his voice softer now, "that you need to reconsider what it means to be in control. Art isn't just about owning it, it's about understanding its place in the world. And you're starting to see that now." Charles knew he had no choice but to listen. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and Ian Blackwood was no longer the young artist looking for validation. He was now the one calling the shots. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Charles could feel his palms sweat as he stood across from Ian in the Beldrick Gallery. Ian's words from moments before echoed in his mind, "Art isn't just about owning it, it's about understanding its place in the world." It felt like a challenge, one that Charles wasn't sure how to respond to. It was no longer about showcasing Ian's work in his gallery. It wasn't about making a deal to secure his place in the new art world. Ian had already made it clear that he was the one in control, and Charles had nothing left but to navigate this new reality. "So, what now?" Charles asked, his voice tight as he forced himself to meet Ian's steady gaze. Ian smiled faintly. "What now, Mr. Ralston, is that you realize that the art world is evolving. The power is no longer solely in the hands of galleries like yours. It's in the hands of artists and the buyers who choose to support them. You've been a gatekeeper for so long that you've failed to notice the shift. But now, the tables are turned. The question is whether you'll adapt." Charles swallowed, feeling a strange sense of humility washing over him. Ian was right. He had built his entire career on the idea that galleries were the gatekeepers of art, the ones who determined which artists would succeed and which would fade into obscurity. But now, Ian was showing him that the gatekeepers were no longer necessary. Artists were rising on their own, creating a new paradigm, one where the power lay in the hands of those who created, not just those who curated. Are you telling me that you're done with the galleries? Charles asked, his voice strained. That this whole system doesn't matter to you anymore? Ian's smile didn't falter, but his eyes were cold, distant. It matters, but not in the way you think. The art world isn't a closed-off system anymore. We have the tools to connect with buyers directly, to create our own spaces, to control the narrative. The gatekeepers like you have lost their hold. It's not about being an exclusive curator anymore. It's about building a community that truly values art, not just as a commodity, but as something that challenges, that speaks to people on a deeper level. Charles felt a sting at Ian's words. His entire career had been built on making art into a marketable product, but now, it seemed that Ian was leading a revolution, one that questioned everything Charles thought he knew. I never thought of it that way, Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. Most people don't, Ian replied. But that's exactly the point. You've been part of a system that's more interested in selling the story of the artist than the truth of the art. You care more about the market value than the message it carries. And that's why you failed to see my worth. The sting of Ian's words settled deep into Charles's chest. He had always been more interested in the price tags than in the artist's true message. The reality of it hit him hard. For the first time in his life, he realized that the art world he had worked so hard to build was one of his own making, one that favored commodification over creativity, reputation over substance. Charles wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the words didn't come. He was lost, trapped in the realization that he had allowed himself to become a part of a system that valued art less for its intrinsic meaning and more for its potential profit. Ian, on the other hand, had never been a part of that system. He had always been focused on something greater, the impact of his work on the world, the conversation it sparked, and the change it could inspire. The silence between them grew heavy, and Charles realized he had no real response. For the first time, he was faced with the consequences of his actions, the failure to evolve, the failure to understand the true value of art. Ian, sensing the shift in Charles, nodded in understanding. It's not too late, he said, his tone softer now. You can still change. But it's going to take more than just selling my work. It's going to take a shift in your entire mindset. You need to recognize that the world is different now. The art world has changed, and if you want to stay relevant, you need to understand what's at stake. Charles nodded slowly, his mind racing. He could no longer deny it. Ian was right. The art world was no longer the closed-off, exclusive place it once was. Artists had the power to shape their own destinies, to find their own buyers, and to dictate the value of their own work. And the galleries? They were no longer the gatekeepers, they were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. I understand, Charles said finally, his voice steady, though his mind was still spinning. And I want to be part of this new world. I want to help foster that change. I know I've been slow to adapt, but I'm willing to try. I want to learn how to create spaces that support art for the right reasons. Ian nodded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of genuine warmth in his expression. That's all anyone can ask for, Mr. Ralston. It's about learning, growing, and evolving. It's about listening to the artists, the buyers, the people who truly care about the work. If you're willing to do that, then maybe there's a future for you in this new art world. But if you're not, then you'll be left behind. Charles stood there for a long moment, taking in Ian's words. He knew this was his turning point. His career, his life, had just shifted in a way that he couldn't have predicted. It was no longer about holding on to the old systems, the old ways of doing business. It was about embracing change and finding new paths forward. But Charles didn't mind. He had made peace with the fact that not everyone would appreciate the changes. In fact, that was a sign they were on the right track. The true artists, the ones who valued their craft over their paycheck, were the ones he had always wanted to work with. The buyers who saw the value in authenticity, in creativity, in the messages behind the work, they were the ones who would shape the future of the art world. One evening, Charles sat in the gallery with Ian, both of them reflecting on how far they had come. The gallery was hosting another event, this time a celebration of the diverse artists who had joined their movement. The atmosphere was electric, filled with people who had come not just to see the art, but to engage with it, to discuss it, to be moved by it. Ian stood beside him, observing the crowd. "You know," Ian said, his voice thoughtful, "when I first met you, I didn't think this was possible. I didn't think you would be able to see the bigger picture, to understand what I was trying to do." Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't either. I was too caught up in the old way of thinking. But you were right. You were right all along." Ian nodded, a satisfied look crossing his face. "You're not the first person to say that. But you're one of the few who actually listened. You got it. And now look at this." The room was filled with laughter, deep conversations, and a genuine sense of excitement. The art was alive in a way it had never been before. It was no longer just a passive commodity to be bought and sold, it was a living, breathing entity, connecting people in ways that Charles had never imagined. "I never thought I'd be here," Charles said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I never thought I'd be a part of something like this." Ian smiled. "Neither did I. But we're changing things. We're doing it together." The gallery was thriving. New artists, many of them young and previously unknown, were being discovered, celebrated, and given the space to showcase their work without compromise. The buyers were not just wealthy elites anymore, they were passionate patrons of the arts, who were willing to invest in creativity because they believed in it, because they cared about the stories behind the art. Charles had found a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just selling art anymore, he was fostering a movement, a community, and a new world where art was about expression, connection, and social change. And it wasn't just Ian who had inspired him, it was the countless artists who had joined their cause, each one bringing their own unique voice and perspective. The work was never easy. The pushback from the old guard continued, and there were still days when Charles questioned whether they were on the right path. But in those moments of doubt, he would return to the studio, to the gallery, to the art, and he would remember why he had made the change in the first place. In the end, Charles Ralston had found something far greater than success or wealth. He had found fulfillment. He had found purpose. And most importantly, he had found a new way of looking at art, and at life, that would continue to guide him forward. As he stood in the center of the gallery, watching people interact with the art, he knew they were just beginning. The old system was crumbling, and a new world was rising from its ashes. And Charles, with Ian by his side, would be at the forefront of that revolution. The art world had changed, and they had been the ones to lead it.